This is one of the episodes I find to be intimidating. I started Famidaily because I like the weird and obscure games, and I could make a solid argument that Pac-Man is the most famous arcade game of all time. Pac-Man is a cultural phenomenon whose effect lingers to this day, and it's been studied extensively, or at least the arcade game has. The Famicom game, not so much. Mentioning the Atari 2600 port at this point is punching down, but even the multitudes of unofficial ports to computers that existed in 1984 lost something significant in translation. NAMCO did the MSX and Famicom ports themselves. They had to scale the games down a little bit, but everything else in these ports is exactly as it should be. I feel almost foolish describing Pac-Man, but this is a show about how these games play. Pac-Man is the tragic story of a drug addict who crawls through a dingy maze pursued by demons of his own making. He gets through each day by consuming every pill he can find. But only the 4 large pills in the corner are enough to let him battle back his ghosts for a brief time. Malnourishment has turned his skin yellow, as the only fruit he eats are those that are discarded in the maze. With the obligatory wacky description of Pac-Man out of the way, how does this version play? The best thing that the Famicom port does is to move the score and lives off to the right. While the monitor in the arcade machine had the same aspect ratio as the home television set, it was rotated on its side. Obviously, they couldn't expect people to do that at home, so by splitting the screen, they gave the play area the correct proportions. NAMCO is going to continue to use this in home ports of their vertically orientated arcade games. Despite getting the aspect ratio correct, they did have to scale the maze down. The Famicom version has 192 dots in the maze, while the arcade version has 244 dots. However, the Famicom game also crashes at level 256, just like the arcade game does. Over the course of the whole game, that means that the best Famicom score is about 13,000 points lower than the arcade game. But even with those small concessions, the maze layout in Famicom Pac-Man is close enough to the arcade that only experts would notice a difference. There's more to Pac-Man than just eating dots in a maze, though. There were tons of clones in the early 80s that replicated that without actually getting what made Pac-Man special. A hero is nothing without his villains, and what made Pac-Man special was the ghosts. The genius of Pac-Man was in giving each of the ghosts a personality, a set of distinctive rules that they followed for their AI. Those rules were simple, but they led to some interesting emergent behavior. The attract mode breaks down their names and personalities. The red ghost, Akabe, has the personality of being a stalker. When Akabe is on the hunt, she runs directly toward Pac-Man. Pinky is the ambusher. He's always looking just ahead of where Pac-Man is facing and targets that square. Asuke is mercurial according to the attract mode. In practice, what this means is that this ghost tries to pinch you between itself and Akabe. And finally, Guzuta has been given the personality of playing dumb. This is the least threatening ghost, since it really isn't trying to chase Pac-Man down. Instead, Guzuta tries to stay a certain distance away from Pac-Man, and maintain that distance. Besides their personalities, the ghosts have another rule that they follow. Each of them has a corner of the maze that they like to patrol. When they leave the ghost house, they'll go there first, and then at certain intervals, they'll break off pursuit of Pac-Man and return to those patrol routes. Combine all of that together and you get some interesting emergent behavior. The ghosts feel more distinctive than other video game enemies from 1980 did. One more thing before I move on. 3 of the ghosts are named after colors. Akabe and Asuke have red and blue in their names, respectively. Poor Guzuta is the lone man out, but his name implies hesitancy, and that reflects his given personality. As you advance in rounds, the ghosts get faster and you have less time to eat them when you have devoured your own Energizer. It's not a linear progression, though. there will be stages where you have more time on the Energizer. As the ghost speed increases, using the tunnel becomes more important. The ghosts slow down dramatically as they go down that path, so if you're being closely chased, that's an easy way to get away from them. There's a few more key differences between the Famicom version and the arcade game. The Famicom version corrected several bugs in the arcade game that prevented ghosts from being able to get to certain spots. There are no safe places in the maze for Pac-Man in the Famicom game. It also introduced an AI bug where ghosts switching from the pursuit to patrol patterns may wind up pursuing Pac-Man for a bit longer than they're intended to. All of these changes mean that the arcade patterns that can be used to perfectly clear the stages every time don't work on the Famicom. Famicom Pac-Man is still a deterministic game, so it should be possible to find patterns that allow each stage to be cleared, but I couldn't find any. For the time being, you'll just have to play it normally. Naturally, a game as popular as Pac-Man got a Famicom Disk System re-release. But strangely enough, even though there are many entries in the Pac-Man series that were contemporaneous with the Famicom, only one more Pac-Man game is going to be released for the system. 2 more Pac-Man sequels will be released on the NES in the US by way of Tengen. There would eventually be a 3rd Pac-Man game released for the Famicom by NAMCO, and that 3rd game was released in 2020. Since it's not a licensed game, it's really not in the scope of this series. In the end, is the Famicom a good system to play Pac-Man on? I'd say yes. We've had better, more perfect arcade ports since then. But if you want a cartridge that you'd put into a system, turn it on and have Pac-Man ready and waiting for you, the Famicom is the one to go with.